listening to Decrypt.
Hey everyone, I'm Liz and I'm a developer advocate at Evervault.
Hey, I'm Shane, founder of Evervault.
Shane, it's so good to be chatting with you on the show today. I'm really excited to just talk a little bit about our vision for the show and why we're doing it and kind of how it fits into our mission at Evervault.
Likewise, yeah, the show's been a long time in the works, so excited to get it out the door.
Yeah, so I'm sure you've been asked this question a million times, but I would love to hear from you why you started Evervault.
Yeah, I mean, I think the real answer is just frustration. So my background is software engineering. I was building a bunch of tools and products that were handling all sorts of sensitive data. So everything from libraries keeping track of books to labs keeping track of experiments and inventory and so on. And this was sort of early 2010s when things like sending an SMS message had been abstracted for a developer where it was super easy. Things like charging a credit card were really easy as well, and a couple of lines of code using services like Stripe. But encryption was something that I've become very fond of because all these people were trusting me with their data, and I had no idea how to keep it secure. And at the time, I thought I was probably the only person that didn't know how to keep it secure. But having spoken with a bunch of other developers, it seemed pretty obvious that nobody was really thinking about this. And if you wanted to use encryption, which I think is the best tool for solving data breaches, you had to go spend months reading academic papers, spend a bunch of time learning how it works, learning how to implement it. And frankly, developers just don't have that sort of attention span. So Evervault really came about from the perspective of trying to take all that great work that was happening in academia, but making it super accessible for developers. So anybody who's building a piece of software can just integrate simple SDKs or APIs into their software, encrypt all the sensitive data that they have and still do stuff with it. So that if they do get breached or all their data was published on a billboard, it wouldn't actually be a huge deal, as opposed to a bunch of other security companies. And I think most of the cybersecurity industry in general, which are trying to prevent data breaches, we just took the stance that data breaches have already happened in your company or in your, like, you just assume your software has already been breached and just focus on what would happen and how you would mitigate the risk of the data being breached. And encryption is probably the best way of doing that.
Yeah, I think a funny side note, funny to me, is that you were studying law for a bit, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was probably to be somewhat contrarian. I'm definitely sort of computer science by background, but law was pretty interesting because it was just the polar opposite of computer science, and it just kind of threw people off guard a little bit. But I did enjoy it. I think, especially as it relates to, I mean, it's kind of like software for humans a little bit. Instead of kind of programming computers and creating all these rules, it was just sort of the equivalent, but managed by judges and courts and contracts and so on. So there's actually a surprising amount of overlap. But the people who study law and the people who study computer science tend to be polar opposites. I'm obviously generalizing there, but I think for the most part, it's true.
Yeah, definitely. So when you decided then, law was not going to be the way, you were going to focus more on software and particularly on sort of like APIs for encryption and for security. Like, how did you decide what was important? How did you sort of outline what you wanted the focus of this to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd read a bunch about different companies and how they kind of structured their mission and how they were going to, align the company around building a particular product. So for us, it was kind of two things. I wanted to keep the mission really, really simple. So, our mission is to encrypt the web. 3 words is pretty hard to forget. And it's sort of both actionable and easy to understand and also somewhat ambitious as well, which is, I think, generally quite hard to do in 3 words. So once that was kind of decided and, it sort of created a direction for us to build software in. The other thing that I did, I think before we'd even hired the first people on the team, was to create what we called the Encryption Manifesto. Which is basically a set of 8 rules that at the time and even still today are kind of aspirational for our product, but it's kind of basically setting out 8 points where in an ideal world, this is what software to solve encryption or solve privacy or security would look like. And we can kind of then track ourselves over time as we build the product. And hopefully other companies, if they're building products in the same space or building encryption tooling or whatever, can use this as a base for what good encryption looks like. So there's a bunch of different themes that kind of run throughout the Encryption Manifesto, and you can take a look at it on our blog as well. But the kind of core idea is having the best possible encryption, but also with a huge focus on developer experience and ease of integration, just being pragmatic about how the software can be integrated, because companies don't have to encrypt their data. And the only way Evervault will really work is if the barrier to entry and sort of the ease of integration is smooth enough that it's all other things being equal, it's as easy to build an application with encrypted data as it is to build an application with plain text data. And the encryption manifesto sort of creates a roadmap to get there. I think we're not there yet, and I don't know of any companies that are, but it's a really nice way to track ourselves.
Yeah, I think from what I've gathered, from my time at Evervault and sort of like when I was starting to look more into the space, is also that it's just like fairly nascent. Like it's something people have been thinking about for a long time, but actually having things in production that developers can use is kind of like a pretty new thing. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts, since you have been thinking about this for a while. Like, how have you seen the mindset change, or what things have you seen kind of like in the industry and in the market that are sort of a dramatic shift toward focusing on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest thing that's different about encryption relative to a bunch of other spaces, like looking at AI and large language models and so on today, is that encryption is just not glamorous at all, which means that people are naturally not drawn to it. If you're 22 and coming straight out of college, like the last thing you generally would want to do is start working on encryption, because in some ways you can think of security as like a tax on creating new software and building new tooling. Like if you want to create new things, you just want to get the thing out the door, and security can just sometimes slow you down. But I think one of the main trends is just that developers are kind of increasingly responsible for the security of their own software. Historically, in a company that was starting up, for example, they might have product engineers build the product, sign their first 100 users or 1,000 users or whatever. And once they start having issues closing deals because of security, they'll hire somebody whose title is head of security. They'll buy a bunch of external software, and then they'll sort of get a SOC 2 report or something that says they're secure. But the best companies and the best security teams we've seen have sort of basically flipped that on its head and made software engineers responsible for the security of the code that they're writing and deploying. So that's a pretty exciting trend, and it makes complete sense. It's just up until now, the tooling hasn't really existed for encryption. So that's really what we're trying to do. Like we're trying to take what is kind of like a foreign concept to most software engineers, but just distill it down to a really accessible API. And we think that by doing that, your average developer will start thinking about this more and more, and like that tailwind is already starting. But I think it's our job to make sure it happens quicker, and the easiest way to do that is by just focusing and obsessing over developer experience.
Yeah, definitely. I think like some of those abstractions that you mentioned earlier were really focused around like, how do we take this problem that's kind of annoying to do or solve, and just make it really easy for developers. And I think now, because there are so many different libraries and tools and just like everything that go into actually building something, when something has like a really great developer experience, it stands out a lot, especially if you're using a bunch of different other ones and you can very clearly see as a developer, like, the experience for this is terrible and I really hate using it, versus like the experience for this is really nice. And ideally, like for a lot of them, it's kind of set it and forget it, right? Like you just want to set it up and you want it to just work. But if in that process of setting it up, it's really seamless and beautiful, then you have such like a strong association with that. And I think you're also, from like the DevRel perspective, I think a developer is much more likely to recommend that to a friend or a colleague than when they talk to somebody who's trying to solve the same problem as them.
Yeah, I think the great thing about building a tool for developers in general is just that software developers are really good at finding the shortest path to achieve something. So if they know they need to implement security or implement payments or whatever, they'll firstly figure out what the best way of doing it is, but they'll always take the easiest path, which means that they kind of guide you in the direction of what a good developer experience looks like. But it's just really important to focus on that from the early days, because security historically has just been honestly like very kind of marketing and messaging led, and like the technologies themselves don't really get analyzed by software engineers. But when you've got somebody who really cares about the purity of the infrastructure that they're putting in their stack, in the form of a software engineer deciding what way they want to do their data encryption or just secure their infrastructure in general, you can't get away with sort of big marketing messages that sound great in theory, but in practice don't actually make any sense. So yeah, I think that's why building for developers just forces you to create the simplest and sharpest way to to communicate and integrate your product.
Yeah, I know we've talked about this before, that it shouldn't just be building for regulation, right? Like there are those regulation measures that obviously need to be followed, but many times that's not enough.
Yeah, I think one of the things that regulation has done is that it's made people think about it. But the problem is that in some ways, especially when you think about things like GDPR or CCPA, it just invites more questions than there were beforehand. Historically, a developer just had to think about how do I secure the data that I'm collecting on behalf of my customers. But now you have to think about the security of the data you're collecting on behalf of your customers, both from a legal perspective and from a technical perspective. And you have to do everything from making sure that you have a cookie banner on your website to having a list of all the sub-processors in your privacy policy. So it basically means that more people are thrown into the mix when, like our view is that privacy is fundamentally a technology problem. We're like very supportive of all these regulations coming in just because, frankly, the progress towards building more secure software or more privacy preserving software just wouldn't happen in its absence. But it doesn't mean that you actually solve all the problems just by spinning up really fancy and ornate privacy policies. But it's all that's to say, developers should be given tools that sort of abstract away all this legalese. GDPR has 99 articles, which very few people have read. Maybe a handful of privacy lawyers. Developers just want that distilled down into infrastructure that's mostly compliant with it. And because of how broad GDPR is, it's really hard to kind of solve everything in one tool. And we certainly don't claim to do that, and I think very few companies do. But you can make a meaningful headway to being compliant with all these regulations just by focusing on the actual security of the data, because compliance is sort of a secondary effect of having good security. It's not security that's a secondary effect of having compliance, at least in a well-run security team or security engineering team.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm curious, between, when you started Evervault and today, what's something that surprised you? What's like something that when you started Evervault, you never would have thought it would be something that you'd have to like pay attention to or integrate into the product?
I think it's the surprising thing is how long it takes for very, very early stage companies to factor in security into their product development processes. And not to say that a 2-person startup has a very mature product development process in general, but it's interesting to see the change in your framing about how companies think about security from maybe a 2 or 3-person company that might only have a handful of customers through to even a 20 or 30-person company that might have 100 customers or something like that. There's a very, very sudden shift, and there's actually a surprisingly large gulf between those 2-person startups and 20-person startups. The 2-person startups just want to get their first customers in the door, and they're happy to beg, borrow, or steal to make sure that they get them using the product. And security is surprisingly just not something that they think about too much. And I'm sure if a customer asked them about it, they'd have a big story to tell, and they talk about all the encryption at rest that they do and so on. But it takes a surprisingly long time for companies to think about security in a kind of mature way. Not to say that it's only Fortune 500 companies or growth stage venture-backed tech companies. It's sort of around this point where companies have 50 to 100 customers. But my guess at the very start was that everybody cared about security, and the only reason they didn't do anything about it is because the tooling was bad. But there is a pretty large cohort of very early stage companies that just don't spend too much time on it. With the exception of sort of the top 1% who just know that they're sort of optimistic and confident in their product's growth trajectory, and they know that if they're going to be growing, doubling month over month or whatever, that security is going to become a problem in 6 months. So they might as well do it now versus in 6 months. But a lot of the time, not thinking about security from day one is sort of like almost like a pessimistic loser's mindset, where you're just not confident in your own product's growth trajectory, and you just think you'll never get there if you do waste time on or from their perspective, waste time on implementing security tooling.
Yeah. It's really funny too, because I think that there's kind of like an opposite end of the spectrum problem as well. Like My first job as a software engineer, I remember one of the tasks that they gave me was just going through and fixing all of these like SQL injection vulnerabilities. I was like 500, like it was so many, because we had this code base that, had been written quite a while before, and like people were maintaining it here and there, but it was like always getting passed off to different people, so it just like lacked consistency. And then someone realized, like, I don't know, somebody pen tested it and they were like, oh my gosh, like we have to fix these like immediately. So it's interesting because I think like it's bad if you don't think about it from the beginning and then you have to do it later. And it's also bad if you are maintaining something that has like sort of all these flaws that you're not aware of. And like there is something to be said for kind of doing it from the beginning if you can, because that's sort of like the easiest way to catch it and stop it from being an issue later down the line.
Yeah, I think particularly as software matures, a lot of companies just don't even know what data they have. They have databases everywhere. They just keep adding more and more tools on over the years. And like you need a whole team that's responsible for even understanding what your architecture looks like. And that just gets really, really messy. There's a bunch of software and late stage companies that I think should just be burnt to the ground, but it's just very hard to make a business case for it because I think especially if you look at something like security, unlike say sales tooling, where you can say for every $1,000 that we spend on this tooling, we're going to generate $2,000 in incremental revenue. You can make a very similar argument for security. It's just way harder to quantify. So it's a very binary thing. It's like either we do get breached or we don't get breached. If we do get breached, it's a huge deal, and like our business is probably ruined for years to come. But there's a chance that we don't get breached and we don't get caught. So it becomes easier for these things to slip through the cracks just because they're not as attributable as sales and marketing tooling, for example.
Yeah. I'm wondering, like I know we talked about, and we'll talk a little bit more about like why we're doing the show and what listeners can expect from it. But, one of the questions that we talked about having guests answer is what's a really difficult or interesting sort of incident that you've had to deal with. So wondering if there's any of those that stick out for you, either that you've sort of dealt with firsthand or helped, a customer out with, or just seen kind of out in the wild.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of varying degrees. I would say from a personal perspective, the first ever kind of software tool that I launched was a library management system. And sort of to your point about SQL injections, it was the first time I'd ever used SQL in practice. So even just knowing to escape apostrophes and so on, that was definitely a lesson I learned further down the line once other people had a look at the source code and they were like, oh, you should probably fix this. So thankfully nothing bad came of that. But I guess somewhat masochistically, my favorite breach that I've kind of read about recently is the Capital One breach, just because it's so simple. Publicly exposed S3 bucket containing PDFs of everything from credit scores to mortgage applications for millions of US citizens. Like, people expect that all these data breaches are these hugely complex attacks where people are installing ransomware and malware and so on. Sometimes people just accidentally leave things publicly accessible on the internet, and somebody just has to guess the domain name or even just type into Google, Capital One documents, and these things come out. So that one's particularly scary just because of how simple it was and how easily avoidable it was. But without those checks in place and even just having good hygiene around what infrastructure you're exposing to the web, it's just really, really hard for organizations of that size to prevent.
Yeah, I definitely have a lot of empathy now for S3 bucket builders and maintainers because I was working on something recently to upload encrypted files to S3, and I actually didn't realize sort of all the configuration bits that you have to get right for it to work properly. And like when I was doing it, it's like for a demo, so I was definitely doing some workarounds, allowing any host to make a request, that type of thing. But I was thinking as I was doing it, like it would be so easy to do what I did, right? Just be like, oh, I'm just going to do this to get it working and I'll go back later and fix it. But everybody's busy. Everybody's got a million different things they need to do. And it's one of those things that's just so easy to forget to go back and fix or go back and reconfigure.
Yeah, later never comes, 99% of the time. I think there's some great things that AWS have been doing just on S3 bucket security in general, where I think effective a couple of months ago, they've sort of disabled public access by default on all new buckets that are created, but there's still millions or billions of existing S3 buckets that don't have any of that configuration. So yeah, it's not particularly difficult to just even go to Google or one of those tools and type in a company's name and figure out what they have publicly exposed in the internet. It's quite surprising how much of it is just exposed.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit too about sort of like how we use AWS, how we're using Nitro enclaves. I think one of the technologies that I'm the most excited about is confidential containers, and running data in use securely. So would love to just kind of hear about what that journey was like for you of like deciding to take things in that direction.
Yeah. So I guess the simple distillation of why encryption over the last like 20 years or even more hasn't really solved all the problems it should is that to actually do stuff with encrypted data, you have to decrypt it again, which means you're effectively back to square one. And like, sure, you can de-risk particular databases or particular S3 buckets or whatever that might store sensitive data. But fundamentally, the code that you're building to process the sensitive data still needs to have the key and it still needs to decrypt the sensitive data. So I've always been fascinated about how you can solve this sort of data in use problem where if you think about it as a triangle where you've got encryption in transit, encryption at rest, and encryption in use, those things are now possible with things like confidential computing and secure enclaves specifically. So as a like high level overview of what secure enclaves are, they're effectively isolated virtual machines in the case of AWS, where AWS attests the integrity of the code that you're running inside them. So if you have a Docker image or some sort of application that you want to deploy inside a secure enclave, you can basically sign it, deploy it to the enclave, and then before you send it any sensitive data, you can prove that the code that's running inside it hasn't been tampered with and is the code that you signed. So if you've got some open source tooling and other people can verify it and so on, it provides like very, very strong security guarantees. But the challenge is it's just really, really difficult to re-architect applications to fit into secure enclaves. So we were sort of a design partner for AWS Nitro enclaves as they were being kind of rolled out into beta. And we launched Cages as a result. And what Cages is basically a really easy way to take any existing Docker file that hasn't been designed to be deployed in a secure enclave. You basically just build it using our CLI, deploy it to Evervault, and we just give you a domain name. So we make it really easy to build, deploy, and scale secure enclaves powered by AWS Nitro enclaves. And any data that you encrypt with any of the other Evervault tools is fully decryptable and processable within one of these AWS Nitro enclaves. So it's technology that I'm very excited about. And I think it's only a matter of time before it gets adopted by everybody, just because it makes complete sense. You instantly out of the box get way more sort of rigorous and just stronger security guarantees that you wouldn't get elsewhere. So yeah, that's been our kind of journey in confidential computing in general.
Yeah, we had this little like internal hackathon maybe like a month ago where the developers from Evervault built different use cases with Cages, and it was so awesome to see. Like I was actually so impressed by just the different things that people came up with. And I'm like wondering, is there any particular use case or application that you're especially excited about when it comes to this technology?
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to lean too much into hype and buzz right now, but I think when it comes to things like large language model training, NVIDIA have new chips that have effectively secure enclaves built in. So if you want to train a model on a really sensitive data set, you can attest that that the data is only being decrypted by an NVIDIA GPU when it's kind of going through the training cycles. You can then basically take that model, have it fully encrypted, and deploy it inside a secure enclave to do all your inference. And the secure enclaves on something like an NVIDIA GPU could very easily be connected to the secure enclave on an AWS Nitro enclave or one of the other chip technologies with sort of like a fully attestable chain. And what that means is basically all these concerns that people have about third-party providers for large language models like OpenAI building ChatGPT or whatever, where you just have to send all your sensitive data off to a third-party server. It's only a matter of time before you can host these things internally, get guarantees that none of the data that you're sending to them is leaking anywhere. And it means that we'll see a bunch more exciting use cases beyond tell me more about this celebrity. It'll kind of move much more towards sensitive patient data, financial records, and a bunch of other use cases that just large businesses will just get huge value from.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about, this show and why we're doing this. I can speak to sort of like my side of it because, I noticed when I started working as an advocate here that there were different developers that were already in our community that were doing some really incredible work. And I wanted to just kind of chat with them informally about what they were working on. And then in those conversations, I was like, well, actually, I think it would be cool if we recorded this because I think a lot of this is knowledge that is helpful for everyone. We recently open sourced Cages. I think we're really moving toward that model of like wanting to share knowledge, wanting to share information. And this seemed like a really natural fit for kind of like sticking with that mindset of just, making knowledge open and accessible for anyone who might be looking for it. But would also love to hear from you about sort of what your vision for the show is and what you're excited about.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the show in general, it's just a case of having conversations with people that are very forward thinking and in security. And I think a lot of the conversations that I'll be having are with basically security leaders that are forward thinking and actually doing interesting new stuff. I think one of the interesting things that's happened over the last maybe 5 or 10 years is that security leaders have just become much more technical. So instead of coming from maybe a compliance background, they tend to come much more from engineering backgrounds now. And as a result, they're sort of just approaching security from a very different perspective when compared to security leaders of maybe 20 years ago. But a lot of them just aren't particularly outspoken. So, a bunch of calls that we've had with and meetings that we've had with these people, like I've learned a bunch from, and a lot of their kind of opinions and ideas have informed a lot of our product roadmap. So I think it's just really important that we have these conversations so that people can hear what the best security leaders are doing. And, if you're a 2-person startup or a 20-person startup, being able to learn from some of the best security leaders on how you can improve your security. I think that's just really, really important. And hopefully someone else comes up with a new synthesis of other great ideas just from listening to a couple of the episodes.
Yeah, fully agree. Cool. Is there anything else that you wanted to share or talk about?
No, I mean, I think recently we've been very active about kind of new updates in our product security on things like Twitter and Discord and so on. But all the updates will be shared pretty openly on places like there. But really looking forward to rolling this show out and hopefully having it up and running for hundreds or thousands of episodes.
Yeah, and hopefully when we cut this together, we'll have a song from you, Shane, to include for the intro and the outro.
Maybe, yeah, I could turn my
amateur. In case
amateur...
anybody didn't know, yeah, Shane was an almost lawyer and is a side gig music producer from when he's not running Evervault.
Yeah, very mediocre, I must say. I've published a handful of pieces, but every time I listen to them, I get more and more annoyed at how bad the music is. But someday there'll be a good song in there.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks, Shane. It was great chatting to you today.
Likewise. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks so much for joining us for the first episode of Decrypt. We hope that you'll join us for future episodes with developers and security leaders. So be sure to subscribe to our channel here so that you can get updates on all future episodes. See you next time.
Decrypt.